Daniel Johnson had spent his whole life working the land. Corn, soy, cattle. It didn't matter. He knew the rhythm of planting and harvest better than he knew his own reflection, and his hands carried the memory of decades in their calluses. His farm sat outside Decatur, Illinois, on ground that had been in the family since his grandfather's time, but lately the work felt heavier than it used to. Prices dipped, equipment repairs piled up, and the bank kept sending reminders that didn't care about weather or drought. His father had always told him that a farmer could live on thin margins, but not on borrowed time. Daniel felt both closing in. That was why, one winter evening, when he stumbled across the listing on an auction site, he didn't think much before clicking through. Historic properties across the South, most going for pennies compared to even a rundown barn up north. He wasn't looking for a mansion, but for land, more acres to work, maybe to rent out or sell to cover his debts. The photo was grainy, a house half hidden behind trees, its details blurred into shadow. The description read only, Lot 12, historic property, buyer assumes all liability. He figured maybe there'd be tillable acres around it, maybe something he could lease or resell. His bid was casual, almost careless. He set his limit low, thinking someone else would snatch it quick. Then the numbers rolled, the counter ticked down, and before he could back out the screen flashed. Congratulations. You've won Lot 12. Daniel sat back in his chair, a knot tightening in his gut. He clicked the details, and the photograph opened larger. What stared back at him wasn't farmland at all, but a crumbling 3-story mansion, its roof sagging, shutters dangling, porch swallowed by vines. Beneath it, a line, the Whitlock House, Cedar Grove County, Mississippi, built 1899. He cursed under his breath. Too late. The sale was final, the money already pulled from his account. He called the auction line, explained it was a mistake, but the clerk's voice was flat. All bids were binding. Within weeks, after long nights staring at bank papers and half-empty feed bills, Daniel loaded up what he could in his old Ford and headed south. It wasn't like he had much to lose. The Illinois winters had grown harsher, the soil less forgiving. Maybe a mistake could turn into a chance. Maybe land was land, no matter the shape of the house sitting on it. The road to Cedar Grove felt like slipping backward in time. Gas stations dwindled into single pumps, towns shrank to a diner, a feed store, and a church steeple. When Daniel finally rolled down the long dirt drive, the Whitlock house appeared through the curtain of overgrown trees. It was bigger than the photo, looming, its windows boarded, paint flayed by years of sun and storms. The porch sagged like a tired jaw, and vines wrapped around its pillars like snakes that had been waiting decades. Daniel killed the engine and sat for a long time, staring. The air itself seemed heavier here, still in a way that pressed against his chest. He stepped out, boots crunching over leaves and gravel. The silence of the land met him like an unspoken challenge. A crow burst from a nearby branch, its cry echoing too loud in the quiet. Daniel adjusted his cap, squared his shoulders, and muttered, "Well, here we are." Inside town, the reception hadn't been warm. At the general store, when he'd asked for directions to the property, the old man behind the counter narrowed his eyes. "You're the one bought the Whitlock place?" Daniel nodded. The man shook his head slowly. "Ain't nobody stayed in that house longer than a season. Some say it don't want to be lived in." Daniel had forced a laugh, the kind that didn't sound right even to his own ears. But now, standing before the mansion, he understood why folks said it. The place didn't just look abandoned. It looked watchful. He hauled his duffel out of the truck and walked up the porch. The boards groaned beneath his weight, but held. The front door was swollen with age. He had to shove hard before it gave way, opening into a hall that smelled of dust, wood rot, and time itself. The air was cooler inside, damp, as though the house breathed a different weather than the world outside. Shafts of light leaked through gaps in the boards, casting pale stripes across warped floorboards. Cobwebs clung to the corners like drapes. An old chandelier, its crystals dulled and missing half their teeth, swayed faintly though no wind moved. Daniel dropped his bag and took it in. He'd slept in barns, in the cabs of tractors, once under an overturned hay wagon when a storm caught him out late. He figured he could sleep anywhere. He unrolled his bedroll in the wide hall and set his lantern nearby. But when he lay down, the silence pressed close. It wasn't the silence of open fields he knew. This silence had a weight to it, as if the house itself was listening. That first night, he dreamed of footsteps pacing above him, though he hadn't dared climb the stairs. Once he thought he heard humming, soft, like a lullaby through the boards. He told himself it was just the creaks of settling timber, wind sneaking through cracks. But when dawn filtered in grey and thin, his mouth was dry, and he knew he hadn't really slept. The second day, he walked the land. Weeds waist-high covered what must once have been gardens. Vines gripped the brick chimneys, and behind the house, a tangle of trees leaned over what might have been a path. He hacked through with a rusted machete he'd brought, his boots sinking in damp earth. That was when he stumbled over stone. Kneeling, he brushed away ivy and moss. A headstone, weathered nearly blank but still bearing faint letters. Johnson, 1873. His breath caught, his own name carved into this forgotten ground. He stood very still, listening to the insects pulse in the underbrush and the slow drip of water somewhere deeper in the trees. Johnson, 1873. The stone leaned, as if the ground itself had given up holding it straight a long time ago. He ran his thumb over the chiseled letters and felt the grit crumble beneath his nail. He told himself it was a common name, a coincidence. Plenty of Johnsons in the world. Still, he marked the spot with a broken branch and kept going, clearing a rough path with the machete until he hit another stone, and another. Smaller markers whose names were mostly eaten by time. Children, some of them by the size and shape. A low wall of stacked fieldstone ringed a space that might once have been a family plot, and to one side, half swallowed by an oak's roots, a short crypt squatted like a box abandoned by a giant. Iron bands crossed its door, rotted by rust but still clenched. He put his hand on the iron to test it and felt the metal's chill bite his palm. He didn't force it. Not yet. He stood back, took in the lay of the ground, and felt that quiet he hadn't known since his father's funeral come down around him. There was love here once, and grief, and work so hard it changed a person's back for good. He'd known all that in Illinois, in rows of corn that never ended if you started walking at the wrong time of day. But here it felt older, like layers of voices built up on the same air. By afternoon, he had mapped enough in his head to know the yard was a maze he could lose days to, and the light through the trees had shifted toward evening. He went back to the house and stood at the bottom of the front steps, staring up. He could leave, he thought. Drive back to town, hole up in the motel behind the feed store, call the auction and make noise until somebody caved. But the thought of the headstone with his name on it tugged at him. He'd never been a man to run once he put his boots down in a place. Inside, he opened more doors. A room to the left held a collapsed ceiling, the lath and plaster scattered across a long table that still wore the ghost of a tablecloth in dust and pattern. To the right, a parlour with velvet curtains so eaten by moths they drooped into threads. He moved slow, careful with his steps on boards that might not forgive a wrong choice. In the hall a staircase rose, the banister thick with grime but carved from a wood that had kept its pride. He wiped a patch with his sleeve and found a smoothness underneath that once must have shone. Upstairs, he tried doors and found rooms set like forgotten thoughts. A bed frame of iron that could outlast a century, trunks with leather straps stiff as bark, a vanity with a mirror cracked in 2 diagonal lines. When he passed the vanity, something in the mirror made him pause. It wasn't a figure. He'd always hated the way stories put ghosts everywhere you looked. It was a slant of light and shadow that tricked the eye, a suggestion of someone standing just out of frame. He exhaled, steadying himself. "You're tired," he said into the room, which made answering silence sound like it had a voice. In a narrow back hallway, he found a door swollen shut. He shouldered it open and peered down steps pitched steeply into shadow. The smell of earth and old iron drifted up from below. He angled his flashlight into the dark and saw a dirt floor flecked with nailed-down planks, where someone once wanted a solid place to stand. The bulb threw a shaky circle of light over a pile of crates and the snarled guts of a boiler that hadn't breathed in 50 years. He descended, testing each tread. At the bottom, he found a trunk bound with iron, its hinges red with rust blooms. He knelt, ran his fingers under the lip, and pried. The lid lifted with a long, reluctant sigh. Inside lay papers that had gone the colour of weak tea, tied in bundles with ribbon turned the grey of old string. A square of cloth wrapped around a hard rectangle might once have been a book. He peeled the cloth back and found a ledger, its leather cracked but holding. He opened it, and letters came up to meet him, neat and careful, the kind of hand taught by someone who had time to lean over a child at a wooden table and tap the knuckles that strayed. He read a line, then two. The entries began with lists: salt, sugar, lamp oil, wages to be paid that never were. But further in, the lists gave way to sentences that carried weight. We work until the moon forgets our faces. He blinked and read the signature at the bottom of a page where the words changed from numbers to breath. Sarah Johnson. He closed the book, because his heart had started to push hard enough to show in his throat. It's a common name, he told himself again, though it had sounded thinner the second time he'd thought it out by the graves. He set the ledger aside and lifted a stack of loose photographs, their edges curled. In one, a group stood in front of the very house he was under now. A white family dressed like they were about to sit for a portrait, even before the camera found them. On either side, the people who made their comfort possible, their clothes spare, their faces holding a stillness that wasn't submission so much as the discipline of surviving. On the far right, a man who could have been Daniel around the eyes. He had his grandfather's square jaw. The sensation that he had stepped sideways and caught his own blood from another century made his scalp prickle. He sat on the basement steps and breathed for a while. He wasn't a man for flights of fancy. He knew how a tractor sounded when it was about to fail and could tell you the rain by smell long before a forecast. He didn't know what to do with photographs of faces that felt like mirrors, or a signature that seemed to thread a line through the ground and up into his chest. He took the ledger and a handful of letters up into the hall where the light, even borrowed through boards, felt kinder. He read until the lantern guttered low. The letters were not addressed to anyone who could answer. Some were prayers written in the shape of lists. Some were accounts of long days and bad nights. Some had a steel thread braided through. They gather at the big table and eat, and do not look toward the door where we stand. I keep the book because records are a kind of faith. If I write it, it happened. If I keep it, they cannot take it from me without burning the paper and my hands with it. He fell asleep with his back against the wall and the ledger across his knees, and he dreamed not of footsteps this time, but of a woman's hand steady over a page as she wrote, and of the sound of a pen scratching its way toward a future it had to believe would read it. Morning came thin and pale. He heated coffee on a camping stove and drank it black, then drove into town, letters tucked into a manila folder he'd found in an upstairs desk. He parked outside the library, a square brick building with windows so clean he could see the fiction stacks without stepping inside. The bell over the door chimed like a coin tapped against glass, and the woman behind the desk looked up with a face that seemed to be made of all the days she'd been here watching other people's stories. "You're the one up at Whitlock," she said. He nodded. "I need old records," he said. "Census, land, newspaper if you got it." "You'll want the microfilm," she said, and the way she said it made him think no one wanted the microfilm, and she was glad when they did. She led him to a machine older than his first truck and showed him how to wind the reels. He worked his way through years that turned fast, dates flicking past like fence posts. Cedar Grove Chronicle, 1899. 1907, 1912. Mentions of Whitlock in columns about harvest festivals and church suppers, and then, in the summer of 1913, a piece that wasn't a piece so much as a gap. A notice about a family that had removed to parts unknown, and a sentence about domestic staff discontinued, and then nothing at all, like anyone had gone looking. He looked up. The librarian stood as if she hadn't moved since he'd come in, her eyes on the window. "You know folks don't like to talk about that house," she said without turning. "My mother said it was a place people left and didn't come back to, but it's a house like any other. Wood and stone hold what you put into them." "Did you ever hear the name Johnson?" he asked. "Down there?" "Not mine, from then." She came to stand beside the machine. He watched her read the lines backward and forward like she was counting stitches. There were Johnsons, she said. There are always Johnsons. But there was a Sarah, she stopped. If you're going to live out there, you ought to know you're not the first to try. Most folks sell. Some go in the night. I'm not going in the night, he said, and surprised himself with how much he meant it. He copied what he could, jotted names and dates in a notebook. On his way out, he bought a sandwich from the diner and ate it in the truck, watching town move around him at a slow, habitual pace. A man he'd seen at the feed store walked by and glanced once, quick, like he was checking a fence line, then looked away. Daniel thought of Illinois, where everyone knew which ditch washed out and who was short hay and who'd put in for a loan. He didn't yet know what this town knew, or what it chose not to. Back at the house, he kept working. He cleared a corridor of fallen lath with a square shovel until he could breathe without tasting plaster. He pried boards off a window in the library to coax in daylight, and found that underneath the boards someone had carved symbols into the sill. Simple marks like stars with long tails, circles crossed with lines. He'd seen farmers nail a horseshoe above a doorway and say it kept luck from spilling out. He didn't know this language, but he recognized the human need in it. He ran his hand along the paneling of the library where the wood had buckled. Near the corner, a draft lifted the hair on his wrist. He pressed his palm flat and felt cold come through, as if the house exhaled there. He rapped his knuckles against the paneling. It answered with a hollowness that didn't match the wall. He fetched a crowbar from the truck. The first try did nothing but complain. The second shifted something inside with the sound of nails remembering their purpose. He wedged the bar and levered, shoulder and back, working in a way that felt like pulling a stump. The panel gave a sudden inch, then another, swinging out from a seam so fine he wouldn't have seen it if the draft hadn't pointed his hand. Behind it, a narrow passage opened. The air in it still in the way bottom water is still. He stood there and let the wordless sense of being on the lip of something make its way into him. He thought of his father opening the door to the corn crib the morning after the storm flattened their best field, and the set of his shoulders before he stepped in, because looking was the only way anything got changed. He slid into the passage sideways and moved toward the second door at its end. Plain wood, iron handle that didn't yield until he put his weight on it and asked twice. The room beyond was small. The light that fell through a high, narrow window had the quality of being filtered through time. Shelves lined the walls and held boxes like the ones in the basement, but less ruined, as if the air in here was different. A table stood in the center. On it, a ledger lay open, a pen beside it, whose nib had gone to rust, but whose intention lingered. He stepped in and felt a pressure ease, the way a calf stops straining once you get the rope around the right leg. He crossed to the table and read, and the writing he'd met on the basement steps met him again with a steadier hand. This is the room they cannot find, because they do not know to look for it. This is the room that keeps our names when our mouths are too tired to say them. This is the room where I put the truth. Sarah Johnson had written the pages like a field measured by steps. The house's purchases, who came and who left, the doctor called for a fever and not for a beating, the nights when laughter from the dining room slid under the kitchen door and made the cook's hands shake as she kneaded bread, and then entries that changed shape, the sentences tightening. They speak in whispers now when they think we cannot hear. He drinks earlier. He keeps a pistol under the piano lid. We hide bread in the ash bucket. We are not alone. Daniel turned a page and felt the skin of his hands lift. The words didn't say revolt. They said a line of days strained to breaking and then simply not breaking anymore. One entry mentioned a key and a door under the stairs that stuck in damp weather. Another listed names that matched the graves he had uncovered under the oak. Ruth, Thomas, Eliza. He closed his eyes and pictured the layout of the downstairs hall. At the back, near the pantry, there had been a door he hadn't bothered with yet, because the frame had gone crooked. He opened his eyes. He finished the page and read the last lines twice. If you are mine, and you find this, know we rose because we wanted our children to walk these floors without being sent for with a bell. No, I am not afraid. He sat on the chair and thought of his own father's bell, the one that hung in the yard and called them in from the back 40 when storms came sudden. He thought of bells and who answered them, and how a sound could mean shelter or command, depending on whose mouth it left. He took what he could carry, 2 letters, a map Sarah had drawn with the neat assuredness of someone who had walked the lines with her feet, and he went back through the passage and into the house that now felt less hostile than stubborn. He found the door under the rear stairs, its bottom chewed by years of damp, its frame warped. He shouldered it until it gave with a grunt and a handful of flakes, and behind it the space was tight as a cupboard and twice as reluctant. His flashlight beam found a hook, a key hanging from it, and for a second he thought of how many days a person had to live to leave a key like that on purpose for a century. He followed Sarah's map out to the crypt as evening came down in layers. The iron bands didn't look like they'd agree to anything lightly. He soaked them with oil from the truck and waited, and when he pried at them with the bar, they groaned, and then lifted in increments so small he had to talk to himself to keep standing at it. The door moved enough to send a breath of cold air out across his face, and with it a smell of stone and something sweet like old flowers that had dried and lost their colour, but not their intention. Inside, the space was short and lined with the kind of brick that keeps secrets without trying. There were names carved into plaques that hadn't seen rainfall in 100 years. In the corner, a small box sat on a shelf, plain wood darkened with oil and time. He lifted the lid and found a folded scrap of cloth that had been a dress once, hand-stitched, the thread still visible where it turned at the hem. Under the cloth lay a brooch, tarnish gone almost black. He set them back, touched his fingers to the plaques, and spoke names out loud because paper wasn't the only way to make a record. When he stepped back into the evening, a figure stood at the edge of the trees. He tensed and lifted the crowbar half without thinking, then lowered it. It was the man from the feed store, hat in hand, watching the house like it might move if he blinked. "You need help with that roof," the man said, not as a question. "I do." "Name's Curtis," the man said. "My granddaddy worked down here. Folks say things. Mostly they say the wrong parts. You gonna try and live in it?" "I am." Curtis nodded once. "All right, then." They worked the next day on the west wing, where rain had chewed through the shingles. Curtis brought a boy from the lumberyard who didn't say much but could carry twice what Daniel could, and in the afternoon a woman from the diner drove up and set a foil pan on the porch and said, "Eat while it's hot," and left without waiting for thanks. The town came like that, one at a time, leaving small proofs of a kind of acceptance that didn't need declaring. At night, Daniel read. He cleaned the letters with a brush, soft as breath, and slid them into sleeves he'd bought at the library from a box the librarian kept under the desk for people who still believed paper mattered. He pinned Sarah's map to the wall with finished nails and stood back, recognizing the lines he'd walked that day and the ones he hadn't yet. The house changed as he worked. That didn't mean the humming stopped, or the way the shadows gathered sometimes in corners that had no reason to be darker than the rest. It meant the sound of his footsteps started to sound less like trespass and more like the noise homes make when they're trying to remember how to be lived in. He sanded the banister until the wood woke up and showed him the grain it had been hiding, and he polished it with oil the way his father had taught him to polish a saddle, not to make it pretty for someone else's eye, but to feed what kept it from cracking. He ran out of money the way you run out of daylight in winter. He sold an old header he'd been saving for a season that never came and put the cash into shingles and joists. He ate beans and cornbread until a man could have measured him with a string and found less of him week by week. When he thought about quitting, he walked to the graves and said the names he knew and the ones he didn't yet, and that kept his hands moving. The day he pulled the last of the boards off the front windows and sunlight poured into the hall like a promise kept, he set the lantern down and didn't light it that night. He stood where the staircase began and imagined footsteps that had once gone up and down, and he didn't hear fear in them anymore. He heard carrying, of water, of food, of babies from one room to another, of a life that had been heavy and yet made with care. He wrote to his cousins and to an aunt in St. Louis, who had the family Bible with a pocket in the back where papers went when no one knew where else to put them. He sent photos of the ledger pages and a copy of a letter where Sarah signed her name full, Sarah Johnson, and then a word he couldn't quite make out that might have been mother or might have been witness. The aunt called him and cried, not loud, more like water finding its level. My grandmother talked about her grandmother, she said, but only on days when the heat made the kitchen feel like the past was standing right there. I thought they were stories, so we'd behave. They were stories, so we'd remember, he said, and his voice had a steadiness to it he didn't know he'd been missing. When the roof was whole, and the worst of the rot had been cut out and replaced with boards that ran tight enough to make a carpenter nod, when the vines on the porch had been pulled and the wood underneath cleaned until the carvings looked like they had meaning again, he took a day and did nothing but walk the rooms. He touched walls like a man might touch the faces of his children when they'd been gone a long time and just come back. He stopped in the library and opened the hidden door because leaving it closed felt wrong now, like shutting the mouth of a storyteller mid-sentence. He told Curtis his plan in the easy shade under the oak. I want people to see it, he said. Not like a tour with a script somebody else wrote, like a place where we say the names, where they know who cooked the food and who ate it and why that matters still. Curtis spat into the leaves and nodded. Folks won't like all of it, he said. Likely not, Daniel said. But I like it less when they don't like the truth. They set a date not because the house was finished. Houses like that are never finished, but because a season had turned. Word went around the town the way word does, where everyone shares a pipe wrench and a sorrow or two. On a Saturday so bright it felt like the heat had been washed the day before, cars came up the long drive in a slow procession that made Daniel think of funerals and weddings both. He stood on the porch in a shirt he hadn't worn since his sister's child was christened, and he watched faces he only half knew step onto boards his hands had fixed. He led them through the rooms and let the house speak where it could. In the library, he pressed the panel and opened the passage. And even men who'd swung hammers their whole lives leaned in like boys at the edge of a secret. In the small room they listened while he read from the ledger, Sarah's words falling into the hush like nails into wood, straight and necessary. Some folks turned away and stared out the high window like the light had gone too bright. Some nodded like they'd been waiting so long to hear a sentence finished that the relief made their jaw loosen. They filed out to the grove where the stones leaned, and Daniel spoke the names carved shallow and the names that lived on the pages, and he asked people to add the names they held in their own mouths if they had them. The words made a rope, and for a while everybody pulled. He slept that night in the hall where he'd first rolled out his bed. The house was quiet, but not empty. He woke before dawn in that farmer way that doesn't ask permission, and went out to the steps with coffee. The light came up slow, touching the edges of the porch, and then the yard, and then the top of the crypt where he'd planted flowers that didn't mind the heat, and he felt something let go inside him and take root at the same time. A breeze moved through the magnolias and across his face. He thought of how many mornings it had crossed this porch, and how many ears it had carried news to, bad and good, born and buried, planted and harvested. He thought of Illinois and the fields that had taught his back the shape of work, and he thought of Mississippi, where the work was now accounted different but demanded the same thing from a man. Show up, listen, put your hands where they help. Later, he scrubbed the last of the grime off a brass plate he'd found in a drawer and screwed it to the newel post at the bottom of the stairs. It didn't say Whitlock. He'd thought about that, but the house had more than one name, and most of them had been borrowed to start with. The plate said Johnson House, because the record said Sarah had built a room into its bones and filled it with the record of a life that had been hers and belonged now to anyone who could claim her with their heart, if not their blood. When he tightened the final screw, he stood back, hands on hips, and let the sight of it sit on him until it felt right. Near dusk, he went to the crypt with a lantern, because the light that falls at that hour makes granite look like soft bread, and he liked the way that changed the stones into something his hand could understand. He set the lantern down and sat on the low wall and talked like a man would to a field after rain, not expecting an answer, but leaving room for one. "You were right," he said. "Records are a kind of faith." The lantern flame wavered, and with it the shadows of the oak leaves made a dance on the crypt door that he knew better than to read like a sign. Still, he let himself imagine for a breath that someone had moved in the far edge of the yard, a figure whose dress didn't belong to this day, but whose presence did. He went back inside as night took hold and climbed the stairs. At the top he paused, because the mirror on the vanity caught him like it always did, and for the first time since he'd come, he didn't see the trick of light that looked like a person sneaking up behind him. He saw only himself, tired, thinner, older, but set like a fence post you could hang a gate where you meant it to swing. When he lay down, the house made the kind of sounds houses make when the heat leaves them, and the boards remember cold. In the room under the library, the ledger lay closed. He'd copied enough of it to know he could read it when he needed to, and he didn't need to now. He let the darkness come up around him. He slept the way men sleep after harvest, not because the work is over, but because they can see what they've done standing in rows behind their eyes. In the morning, he woke to the smell of someone frying onions. It took him too long to remember he didn't have a stove hooked up yet, and when he did, he laughed out loud in the empty house, at himself, and at the way memory sometimes puts a thing where you'd like it to be. He made coffee on the little burner and took a cup out to the porch. A pickup rolled up the drive, dust rising behind it like a flag, and Curtis climbed out with 2 lengths of trim he'd milled. "Figured the parlor could use a crown," Curtis said, and Daniel nodded, grateful for the gift and for the way a man will make a sentence sound like a simple observation when it's really an offer. They worked until the shade shifted off the east wall, and the ladder rungs bit the soles of their boots. When they were done, the line where wall met ceiling looked as if it had always intended to be that way. Curtis stepped back, squinted. "You ever think you were supposed to be the one to find it?" he asked, not looking at Daniel. Daniel wiped sweat off his neck with the back of his wrist. He thought of the headstone under the oak, and the ledger's hand, and the hidden room. He thought of the bank letters in a drawer back in Illinois that didn't have power over him here in quite the same way. He thought of Sarah's last lines. "No, I am not afraid. I think the house was supposed to be found," he said. "I think it waited for somebody too stubborn to leave." Curtis grunted, which was as close to a blessing as Daniel could hope for. After Curtis left, Daniel walked the rooms again, a habit now, like checking fences at dusk. In the library, he ran his knuckles over the panel seam as he passed, and in the hall he paused at the plate on the newel and touched the J like a man touching his name carved in the inside of a barn beam. He stepped out onto the porch and stood a long time looking over the yard that still had more wild in it than tame. The path he'd cut to the graves had gone softer at the edges where the grass tried to grow in again. He didn't mind. Paths should argue with you a little, so you remember why you made them. He thought of the first night he'd come, when the house had felt like a thing with its teeth bared. He thought of the nights after, when the humming had woken him like a lullaby sung in a language he was learning, only because he kept showing up to listen. He didn't know if the humming would stop. He didn't need it to. He understood now that some sounds are the way a place keeps time when there aren't clocks around. He picked up a hammer and a handful of finishing nails and went to put up the first photograph in the hall. Not the Whitlocks in their stiff collars, but Sarah's people in their work clothes, standing with their shoulders set as though back then they had already been posing for the future. He leveled it by eye and tapped the nails in with gentle strokes. The glass caught a thin ladder of afternoon sun and made it look like the light inside the picture had come from where he stood. He stepped back and looked, and what he saw was not a mansion reclaimed by a man who'd bought it on accident. What he saw was a house whose story had been taken over by the people who had kept it fed, whose names had been said out loud on its porch. whose words had been saved in a room that kept cool in summer. He saw a place that had decided, finally, to be lived in. A wind came up from the south, and the magnolia leaves turned their pale sides like fish in a wave. Daniel lifted his head into it. He thought of fields and prayers, and the map of a farm he didn't own anymore, and he thought of this land under his feet, not owned so much as held. He'd spent his life working the ground because it was the one constant thing that made sense. Now he understood there was another kind of working to be done, and it required the same things. Patience, sweat, the willingness to learn what the soil would give you listened to it long enough. The house breathed around him, wood resettling, a gentle sigh moving up from the joists like a sleeper turning over. He smiled into it without thinking and went to fetch the next frame.